Okay, so it's hour 3, and we want to start getting our Laravel application to actually talk to our MySQL database and actually work with our data. So far, we've created a home page and a template, and we haven't done much else. We want it to ultimately kind of be like this, where we have albums. So the first thing we need to do is we need to set up an albums view, and we need to point the URL /albums to load that particular view. So in our code editor, inside of views, we already have this welcome. Let's create a new file. Let's create a new PHP file. And we'll call it albums.blade. Again, Blade is just a templating engine that Laravel uses. That allows us to put in these kinds of directives that start with @. We can get rid of everything here because all of our HTML template we're going to use from our layout instead. So if we extend our layouts, this page uses our template, so we get our header and footer. And we'll put on our content section here. So for now, let's just put on an H1 tag. Now, we're going to look at how the dispatching works, right? We have a view called albums now. We have a link that goes to albums. But if I click my albums link, we still get a not found. As I said, the URL mapping doesn't happen automatically. We specifically have to tell the application this URL needs to load this particular view. So we're going to build a controller to handle that logic. In fact, there already is a controller set up for this. Up here, inside our app folder, there's a subfolder called HTTP, and in here we have a file called routes. So in app HTTP. Again, we didn't have to build this file. Composer did it for us when it built out our application's shell. So I click on routes. Inside of app HTTP. Really? Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Let's see. Thank you. Huh. Okay, yours is here. Now, if you have a different version, is there anybody who doesn't have this file? If you don't have this file, has to do with version. Sukhwinder, tell everyone where they can find the file.
In routes, under public, go public folder and routes, and here you can find web.php.
So inside of public, you may have a routes folder. And in there, Sukhwinder, what's it called? So it's in public routes.
Inside routes, we have web.php file.
Web.php. No?
It's down further.
Let's see. Roots. Web.php. So just from the lesson 12, there should be a roots subfolder. It's right here, roots. Web.php. So my file's in a different location, but you can see what's happening, right? When we have requests at slash, so in our root path, we are loading the view called welcome, right? Which was pre-built. We didn't have to create this view. It was pre-built for us. If we didn't want, so there's actually no connection between the path and the view it loads. They can have different names, right? In a traditional, like an HTML application, the link has to match the file name or we get 404. Not with MVC. The URL paths can be different from the actual views that they load. And we provide this, that's what this is happening here. This is called the dispatching, where we're connecting a particular URL path up to load a specific view. So this is our home page. Maybe I'll just make a comment here. So we're going to specify the root. Now, typically, there are two methods we could use for a root. What are our two HTTP methods? We see them in HTML forms. What are the two methods an HTML form has? Post and get, right? So normally, when we're loading a page, which one do we usually use? Yeah, typically we use get. We use post if we're doing a form submit. So here we're going to process a get request. What should the URL be? We've already got a dispatcher in our root URL. Yeah, so when we have a get request made at /albums, we're going to run a function, and we're going to return a view. What's the name of the view we want to return? Yeah, we want to return this albums view, and we ignore the extensions. The extensions are implied. So in this case, we want to. Now when we get requests at this path, we're going to load the view with that name. Now when we do this next term in ASP.NET, it's a little bit more automatic. When we do this next winter with JavaScript, we have to do exactly the same thing when we do Node.js. We manually have to map every path that we're allowing to load a particular view. So now if we save this and click our albums page, it should load this view. So this is how we dispatch the roots using a controller, right? Our controller is the logic. It reads some kind of request made in the user interface. I click the link, and it decides what our application should do. Load a view, redirect to another page, do something else. So the Laravel, the installer, it sets up a default route for our home page, but the rest of them we have to program. If we don't like this name, if we wanted to name this index, that's fine. We could just change this to index and rename our welcome to index, and it would be fine. But the page name really doesn't matter, right? Because the user never sees welcome in the URL. They don't even know, right? This never says welcome. Don't actually see the names of the views, which lets us write friendlier URLs. because they don't see the actual file names of our views. So we've kind of got two parts sort of working. We can dispatch an album's root, and our controller knows what to do with it and returns the proper view. The last thing we want to do today is we want to add this piece. We want our albums view to look like our old albums page. So let's create a table, and then we're going to need to build a model that represents our album data. And before we load the view, we want to use our model to query the database, fetch the list of albums, and then not only are we going to render the view, but we need to pass it all the data from the model so we can display that data in our view. We do need to set up our database. Right now, our application is not configured to talk to our database, right? Before we created a db.php file, Laravel automatically sets one up. They assume we're going to use a database. So right here in the root, there's a file. Let me know if you don't have it, because it might be somewhere else. There's a file here called .env, standing for environment. So this is a whole bunch of configuration variables. So things like whether we're allowing debugging, what's the URL. If we're sending email, we can set up the mail server address and our account to send messages. And in here, you've got your database connection. So this is what it defaults to. Localhost, database name, and homestead and secret. Now you can use either a local MySQL database or use your DreamHost or Azure, doesn't matter. I'm just going to connect to my local. So I'm going to leave the host. I'll change the database name here. I'll change the username, actually, which is root. And I have no password on my local MySQL, so I just put it in as an empty string. So put in the same, whatever database you've been using all along, you can use here. So put in your credentials.
So if we are using DreamHost,
then your host is SQL.computerstudies, or your database name will be GC, and your student number, your username, GC, and your student number, and the password assigned. If you've been using Azure, you just put in those credentials. If you're working locally, then you can basically just leave it as 127.0.0.1. That means localhost. It's the same thing. So use whatever database you've already been using in the course. We don't need a new one. We don't have to include or link to this. Laravel already knows to use this. So again, it's saving us time in our setup. And we only have to configure this one time. We won't have to configure this again. So we've got most of the parts built. We've got a view, we can map to it. We need to build this model now, once our database configuration is saved. So we can actually put our model. They actually give us a model already which means if we want to do authentication, Laravel actually builds a model out for us. Right here up in my app folder, there's a user.php. So we can have a look. So they've defined what a user is. Now we could change this model, but they give it to us to work with right away. Now it's using this library, this dependency called Illuminate. We'll talk about what that is in a minute. So it creates a user object. So those of you who are doing your object-oriented class with Jarrett, this should look somewhat familiar. Right. Here are the properties, name, email, and password, as well as a couple of hidden properties. So we'll just talk about this Illuminate for a minute by looking at their documentation. Laravel uses a tool called Eloquent, which is called an object relationship mapper. So it basically lets us create a model that's a PHP representation of each one of our tables in the database. So it tells us here we can either make a new model from the command line, or we can just write our own. It would look something like this. So this is what our album model is going to look like. We're using the Eloquent library, and we make a public class. We'll call it album. And Laravel's smart enough to know if our model is called album, it maps it to a table called albums in the database. We don't have to point it there. It knows based on the name. So our model names typically are singular, and our database table names are plural. And they're also typically in with the first letter is capital. So you can see here in their example, they created a flight model, and we don't have to specify. It automatically looks for a plural Or we can, if we want, if our names don't match, we can just tell our model, okay, here's the table that the model represents. So this is slightly different from the video. In his video, he talked about that the model actually holds the data.
Back to the fit that password, something like that.
The model doesn't really hold the data. The model is used to represent or talk to our database from within our application. So we're going to go ahead and create our own album model. So inside of app, let's make a new PHP file. And I'm going to call it album with a capital A, because that's the convention for creating models. If you're in the OO class, it's probably the convention you're using with Jarrett when you're creating classes in Java, right? Classes are singular and the first letter is capitalized. Probably what Jarrett taught you, I imagine. So we'll create album. Now it thinks it's a PHP page. It's not. This is a model. We will put on, typically they don't even close the PHP tag, they just open them. We're always going to use a namespace that it's part of our app folder. You can see that in our user. Our user is maybe not a great example because it's a special type of model used for authentication. We may be better off to look at the documentation and kind of base this on their flight sample in their documentation. So let's see what else they've got here. So we're going to use Illuminate Database Eloquent Model. So that tells Laravel this is representing a table in our database. And then we're going to create a class called album that extends model. So our class is of type eloquent model. But here's the cool thing about our model. Because our model is kind of a child of the eloquent model, and it will be the same when we work in other MVC frameworks. This eloquent model, it already has built-in all the built-in methods for doing create, read, update, and delete. So we don't need to write any SQL commands. We don't need to bind parameters. This model will be able to do those things automatically because it's based on this library, and this library already has all those functions. When we work with ASP.NET, we'll work with a similar library called the Entity Framework. When we work with Node.js, we'll work with a library called Mongoose. So we basically won't have to write SQL commands anymore in our web applications. That's what we use these these object relationship mappers. They know we want to do create, read, update, and delete, so they just wrote all the code for us. And we can just call their methods instead of having to write our own. So that also saves us time and reduces errors. You think about how much time we spend writing and debugging our SQL commands. So there's our model. We don't have to define anything else. We don't have to say that an album has a title, has a year, has an artist, because Eloquent knows to just model it based on this. So whatever's in here automatically is included because those items have the same name. They're both called album. So now the last thing we want to do before we load our view, we want to use our album model to run a query and fetch all of the album data so that when we load the view, we can also give it a bunch of data and we can display that in a loop. So let's go back here and let's start our table. For now, we'll just put on a header row as title. We won't see any data yet, but we're just setting up the table header. And we're still going to use a loop in here, but one of the things you're going to notice with Laravel is our syntax is way cleaner. For when we have to write PHP code inside of our HTML views, the syntax is not nearly as messy as it is when we use kind of traditional PHP. So my album view right now looks like that. So before we can try and display the album data in the view, we need to write our query to fetch the albums, and we need that data passed when we load the view. So we need to do a couple of things up at the top of our roots. The first one, link to the album model. Because the album model can do create, read, update, and delete. So if we say use our app, now our controller can access all the functions in the model. So we gave it a namespace of app. So now our controller, can talk to the model. So we'll put on a comment, display. So before we display the view, now we want to use this reference to our model to go and query the database. So we'll create a variable called albums, just like we had in our old PHP code. But now we use our model. This is all we have to do to write a query. Order by, title, ascending, and call get. That's it. That should connect to the database, write our query, and fetch the results. Think about how much code we had to write the old way. Right? We had to first connect to the database. Well, let's look, actually. If we look at our lesson 11, how we did it. So we would connect to the database, we'd set up our query, we'd prepare a command, we'd execute it, we'd store the results. This is all we have to do. And our model knows which table to go to, runs the query, and there's our order by. So now we've got in this variable, just like before, we should have our list of all our album data here. But when we load the view, we also need to include this. It's not enough to load the view. We have to pass the data to the view as well. So here's how we do that. We just set up an array . We're going to pass our data to the page, a variable called albums. Now we should be able to display this data in our view. So our code's way cleaner. And we haven't had to write any SQL or worry about connecting and disconnecting. So our syntax in the view, we now should be able to loop through. We'll use a for each loop like we've used before, but with cleaner syntax. And we should be able to loop through our albums and display them. So we just use an @ for each. And then we say and. Notice we don't need the PHP tags here. This is our blade syntax. We can write these directives that start with @ right in the middle of our HTML. We don't have to keep opening PHP tags. So now we can just do tr ed. And here's how we display the value of each album. We use this syntax, curly brace, curly brace. We'll use this later when we do AngularJS. Anybody know what this syntax is called? For representing dynamic values in HTML. There's a lot of different template engines that use it. It's often called handlebars or mustache syntax, right? Looks like some sideways mustaches or handlebars you grab onto. So now in here, we just output album title. So this is a lot easier, I find, than album and then square brackets and single quotes. We'll output the current album year and album artist. We don't need any angled brackets, square brackets, single quotes, PHP tags. But this code is a lot cleaner and easier to read, easier to type and create than, say, this, right? Where we're concatenating, we're in quotes, we're out of quotes. It's really easy to break something here. Ah, okay. Interesting. Access denied. Notice it's still using the word homestead. Anybody have any idea when we go back to my environment, the word homestead, and I put in my credentials, why do you suppose, why is it still using the old one? And how do we fix this? I've updated the file, but for some reason it's still, when we change PHP code, it seems to update on the fly, but when I change this environment, obviously it didn't update. So what could we do so that it connects to the proper database or it uses the right credentials? Yeah, I need to restart the server. Those environment variables, those get loaded when you start the server. So if you change those environment variables, which we won't have to do very often, you need to stop and restart the server. So still running here, I'll just hit Control-C to stop my server. And to restart it, I just run PHP artisan serve again. That restarts the server.
How did you stop that?
You hit Control-C. On a Mac, it's Command-C. And now let's try again. There we go. So our home page works. And now we have our first kind of full MVC view running. Our dispatcher reads that URL, first goes to the model, runs a query, then loads the view and passes our query result to the view. So all these things are divided up nice and neatly. If Sukhwinder and I are going to work together, if I'm going to do the front end and he's going to do the back end, Sukhwinder can do all of the routing, all the logic in the controllers, and I won't touch this file. I'll just build the views, and we just need to communicate so he knows the names of the views that I'm creating. And he can dispatch any URL to any view that I create. And if my view has to display any data, he just needs to say, okay, here's what the variable is called with your data. Refer to it here. So this has to match. Right? Let's say I call this in my controller, I pass back something called album data. But in my view, I'm looking for an array called albums. Now we get this. My view is looking for something called albums, but my controller is passing in something called album data. So this also helps with our debugging. With regular PHP, if we try and display a variable that doesn't exist, it's just blank. It doesn't crash. Whereas Laravel will crash if we try to refer to a variable that doesn't exist. So it's a way of making sure where our coding is more accurate. So I'll just undo that. And the value that comes from my controller matches, my view will load. So we have this nice little separation, and we've had to write way less code. I mean, if you think about how much code we had to write to get this version to work from scratch, and yes, it was a lot of work today, maybe to get our web server set up, Composer installed. I know a few of you aren't quite there yet. But if we were to go create another project now, if we want to create another website with Laravel, we would just have to go back to our main directory and run the command, run the Composer command, the Composer create command. It would create another website. Set up the database, build a model, build a controller and a view, and our site's up and running already. So this is going to save us a lot of development time. So what we'll do next week is we'll continue with this, and we'll write an add, build a form, and our controller will need to do a post command. So what happens when the form post is submitted? We'll use our model. If it has a get, we can imagine it probably has a create or a save function. So again, we don't have to write an insert command. We don't have to bind any parameters. We don't have to map each field one at a time. All that work goes away. We can write a post and call save, and it'll save our album. Then we can do edit and delete. So you can see, see how it's done. So here was their little task list, and if we look at we can also add validation in our controller, which we'll want to do. But here's what our post is going to look like. You can see it. When we get a post, we create a new instance of our model, we fill the properties, and then we just call save. And the model, our album model, will save it to the database automatically. So we're going to do this first, and then we'll work on delete. Our controller will look something like this, right? Delete album with an ID. We'll find it, and then we'll delete it, and then we'll try and edit. So hopefully next week we'll be able to get all of that working. You're also going to have one final lab next week. Just going to talk for a minute about your final exam, which is in a couple of weeks. Okay. The format of the final exam is similar to the midterm, but there is no multiple choice at all. Okay, the whole thing is practical. At this point, I'm not really interested in you answering questions. I'm interested in you building things. Okay, Laravel will not be on the exam. Okay, so nothing we do today or next week am I testing you on. Okay, this is kind of a nice to know because we're ahead in class and because this will help moving forward. And you may get questions on it in your go-up interviews, right? Think how much better you would have done, how many of those questions you could have answered if your interview was tomorrow. Okay, so nothing from today will be on the test. The test is open book, it's not a memory test. So you'll be allowed to use any of your files, you'll be allowed to use Blackboard, you'll be allowed to use a textbook. Okay, and I will give you 3 hours and I'm gonna say, okay, build a PHP application that does these things. Well, obviously there's going to be some create, read, update, delete on there. I think we can assume that, right? Could be things like uploading a file, could be register login, could be doing searching, right? Some combination of those features will be on there. Okay, so you're probably going to spend a lot of time on the final exam debugging. Right? You might even spend an hour writing the code and 2 hours actually just debugging. So next week, the lab I'm going to give you, which you can take home and do at home, I'll give you days to do it. The idea of the lab is I'm going to give you a PHP site that has a bunch of errors in it, probably about a dozen errors. So you don't have to write any new code. You have to find and fix as many of the errors as you can. So this is good practice for the final exam. So when you have errors, rather than panic and go, it's not working, you maybe have some idea of what things to try in order to fix some of those errors. So that'll be the lab I'll give out the end of class next week. Okay, so we'll keep going with our Laravel site. I'd encourage you to maybe read through their little task application, because it'll give you an idea of where we're going with next week. I'll give out the lab at the end of next week, and you'll have until the next Monday night to finish the lab. But it's a good way to study, a good practice for the exam.
Are we using Laravel for the lab?
No, it'll just be a regular PHP application for the lab. Okay, so what I'm going to do is make all the mistakes that I see every week when I see hands going up, like missing semicolons and, you know, things like that, common mistakes that I see, or if I see mistakes in your assignments, I'll be sure to include some of them in the lab, right? Because if those are mistakes that are commonly made, well, those are things that may happen in the final exam. And we can talk about some common things to look for so you don't get stuck and waste an hour on, you know, a missing semicolon in your final test. All right, that's all for today.